I am Howard Foster, 68 years old, and until last Tuesday, I believed a father's love could eventually repair a shattered family. I was invited to my daughter's home for dinner after a year of absolute painful silence. But when I arrived at her doorstep, her housekeeper stopped me in the freezing cold, her eyes wide with terror, and whispered that I needed to leave immediately. I did not ask questions. I ran to my car, hid down the street, and watched from a distance. 10 minutes later, a vehicle pulled into her driveway that proved my only child had just orchestrated a trap to erase my existence. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from the people you loved in order to protect your own life. For the past 12 months, the silence in my house had been deafening. After my wife passed away from a sudden illness, my daughter Natalie and I drifted apart, a drift that quickly turned into a bitter estrangement. She married Colin, a commercial real estate developer whose ambition was only matched by his profound arrogance. I had spent 40 years working as a logistics director for a major shipping firm, calculating risks, managing supply chains, and building a quiet, secure $4 million retirement estate. I knew the value of hard work. Colin only knew the value of leverage. He built flashy strip malls on credit, drove cars he did not own, and treated my conservative financial advice as a personal insult. When I refused to co-sign a massive commercial loan for him last year, Natalie stopped returning my calls. The punishment was absolute isolation. I spent my days maintaining an empty house, organizing my garden, and quietly hoping that time would soften her anger. Then came the phone call on Tuesday morning. I picked up the receiver and heard Natalie's voice for the first time in a year. She sounded exhausted, but remarkably soft. She told me she missed her mother. She said she realized life was too short to hold on to foolish grudges, and asked if I would come to their house in the suburbs for a private, home-cooked dinner. The relief that washed over me was physically overwhelming. I wanted to believe her so desperately that I completely ignored the analytical instincts that had kept me alive in the corporate world for 4 decades. I spent the afternoon at a high-end bakery, buying the imported Italian pastries she used to love as a little girl. I put on a tailored suit, polished my shoes, and drove across town toward their exclusive gated community. The drive felt like a victory lap. I convinced myself that the storm had finally passed, that Colin had learned to respect my boundaries, and that I was finally getting my daughter back. I pulled into their sprawling neighborhood just as the sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns. Colin and Natalie lived in a massive modern glass and steel structure that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a family home. I parked my modest sedan in the circular driveway, grabbed the box of pastries, and walked toward the towering oak front door. The porch light was off, which struck me as odd for someone expecting a guest, but I dismissed it. I reached out to press the illuminated doorbell. Before my finger could touch the button, the heavy side door of the garage swung open. Sylvia, their housekeeper who had worked for them for 5 years, rushed out into the freezing evening air. She was carrying a heavy black trash bag, clearly using it as a prop to disguise her exit. She dropped the bag onto the concrete the moment she saw me, crossed the driveway in 3 rapid steps, and grabbed my forearm with a grip that bruised my skin. Her breathing was ragged, and her eyes darted frantically toward the dark windows of the living room. She leaned in so close I could feel her shaking. "Do not go inside, Mr. Foster." She whispered the words with a raw, desperate urgency. "They are not waiting to eat with you. Leave this property immediately and do not answer your phone." A lesser man might have demanded an explanation. A foolish man might have pushed past her, indignant and offended, demanding to speak to his daughter. But my entire career had been built on recognizing a catastrophic failure in a system before it caused an explosion. I looked into Sylvia's terrified eyes and saw the absolute truth. There was no dinner. There was no reconciliation. The daughter I loved was waiting on the other side of that door with a loaded weapon of some kind, and this woman was risking her livelihood to give me a chance to survive. I did not speak a single word. I gave Sylvia a brief, sharp nod of gratitude. I turned on my heel, walked silently back to my car, placed the pastries on the passenger seat, and started the engine. I drove exactly 2 blocks down the street, pulled into the dark driveway of an empty house that was up for sale, turned off my headlights, and waited in the suffocating silence of my vehicle. Exactly 10 minutes later, the illusion of my family completely shattered. A plain, unmarked black van turned the corner and drove slowly up the street. It did not have municipal plates. It was not a police cruiser or a standard ambulance. It pulled directly into Natalie's driveway, parking exactly where my car had been resting moments before. The side doors slid open, and 3 men stepped out onto the concrete. 2 of them were large, heavily built men wearing dark tactical scrubs and carrying thick leather restraint belts. The 3rd man stepped out of the passenger seat carrying a heavy medical bag and a stack of legal clipboards. The streetlights illuminated his face for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. My blood ran completely cold. I recognized him from a scathing investigative report published in the local newspaper 6 months ago. He was a private, highly expensive psychiatrist who catered to the ultra-wealthy, a man notorious for signing emergency psychiatric holds and fast-tracking forced medical conservatorships for families looking to lock away their difficult relatives. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with devastating clarity. Colin's commercial real estate market had recently crashed. I had read the financial sections. Interest rates had skyrocketed, and highly leveraged developers were drowning. Colin was bankrupt, and my daughter was going down with him. They did not invite me over to apologize. They invited me over to ambush me in the privacy of their home. If I had walked through that front door, I would have been confronted by those men. Natalie would have played the weeping, terrified daughter, claiming her elderly father had become violently demented and was wandering the streets. The corrupt doctor would have injected me with a chemical sedative, strapped me to a gurney, and locked me in a private psychiatric ward before the sun came up. By tomorrow morning, Colin's lawyers would have filed an emergency conservatorship, deeming me completely unfit to manage my own affairs. They would have gained absolute legal control over my bank accounts, my retirement funds, and my $4 million estate to liquidate it and pay off Colin's catastrophic debts. I sat in the darkness of my car, watching the men walk up to the door my daughter held open for them. The physical pain in my chest was excruciating. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the daughter I had worked 60-hour weeks to put through college, had just sold my freedom and my sanity to save a failing strip mall. The grief threatened to drown me, but the logistics director inside my head coldly, violently pushed the grief aside. There would be time to mourn the death of my family later. Right now, I was a target, and the hunters were currently standing in my daughter's living room, realizing their prey had escaped the trap. I knew exactly what would happen next. When they realized I was not coming, Natalie would call my phone, pretending to be worried. If I answered, they would track my location. If I went to the local police to report them, I would sound like a paranoid, delusional old man spinning wild conspiracy theories about his loving, concerned daughter. The police would likely call the hospital themselves, delivering me right back into the doctor's hands. An accusation without concrete, undeniable proof was just a wealthy man's word against a crying woman holding a doctor's evaluation. The system was designed to protect the predators who knew how to file the right paperwork. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not just power it down. I cracked the casing, ripped the lithium battery out of the back, and shoved the pieces into the glove compartment. I was officially off the grid. I put the car in drive, keeping the headlights off until I was completely out of their manicured, wealthy neighborhood. I drove away from the upscale suburbs, navigating toward the industrial outskirts of the city, where the neon lights flickered and cash was the only currency anyone cared about. I pulled into a rundown roadside motel, paid the clerk for a week in advance using the emergency cash I kept in my wallet, and locked the heavy wooden door of room number 12 behind me. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and stared at the peeling wallpaper. They thought I was an old, obsolete man who would quietly surrender his life's work to their greed. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had failed to spring the trap, and now they had given me a head start. I did not intend to run. I intended to dismantle their entire lives. The pale morning light filtered through the cheap curtains of my motel room. I had not slept a single minute. My mind had spent the entire night mapping out the devastating reality of my situation. I was a wealthy man who suddenly had to act like a fugitive in his own city. The immediate priority was capital. A man without access to his finances is completely paralyzed. I had a substantial amount of emergency cash hidden elsewhere, but I needed to know the exact status of my primary assets. I needed to know how far Natalie and Colin had gone to secure my destruction. I washed my face in the rusted sink, put my tailored suit back on, and walked out into the cold morning air. I did not drive my car. A license plate is a tracking device for anyone looking for you. Instead, I walked a mile and a half down the busy commercial avenue to a large branch of my primary bank. I blended in perfectly with the morning rush of commuters. I was just another retired man running morning errands. No one could see the absolute war raging inside my chest. The heavy glass doors of the bank slid open, and the warm, conditioned air hit my face. The lobby was quiet and orderly, with gleaming marble floors and bright fluorescent lighting. I joined the short line of customers waiting for an available teller. My entire career in logistics had taught me to constantly observe my environment and identify potential bottlenecks or threats. I watched the tellers processing transactions with practiced efficiency. I noticed the security guard standing near the entrance, sipping his coffee and looking casually at his phone. I noted the positioning of the security cameras in the ceiling corners. It all felt so agonizingly normal. But underneath my calm exterior, my heart was beating with a heavy, unnatural rhythm. I stepped up to the polished counter when the next teller became available. She was a young woman with a bright name tag and a polite, professional smile. I did not want to trigger any massive alarms, so I decided to test the waters with a routine request. I asked to withdraw $10,000 in cash for a home renovation project. It was a completely normal transaction for an account holding over $4 million. I handed her my driver license and my platinum debit card. I watched her fingers fly across the computer keyboard. For exactly 10 seconds, everything was fine. Then I saw the exact moment the trap clamped down. The young woman stopped typing. Her pleasant smile vanished completely and was replaced by a tense, uncomfortable frown. She stared at her computer monitor and blinked twice as if she could not believe what she was reading on the screen. She pressed another key and waited. The color slowly drained from her face. She looked up at me and her eyes were completely different. They held a dangerous mixture of pity and fear. She cleared her throat and her voice trembled slightly. She told me politely that she could not process the withdrawal at this time. She said there was a restrictive block placed on my entire financial portfolio. I kept my voice perfectly level and asked her to clarify what a restrictive block meant. She hesitated and looked nervously over her shoulder toward the manager office. She whispered that the system showed a pending emergency legal review. She said a conservatorship flag had been activated late last night by an authorized family member. The polished marble floor seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. The sheer speed of their betrayal was breathtaking. Natalie and Colin had not simply planned to force me into a psychiatric ward the night before. They had already filed the fraudulent court documents before I even arrived for their fake dinner. They had presented the forged medical records to a judge late yesterday afternoon. The dinner invitation was just the final physical step to secure my body while the legal system secured my money. They had weaponized my own wealth and the courts against me. My entire life, savings, my retirement funds, and the equity I had built over 40 grueling years were completely frozen. I was standing in a building holding my life's work, and I could not access a single penny of it. I was suddenly a trespasser in my own financial life. The young teller told me to wait just a moment. She said she needed to get the branch manager to explain the details and help clear up the misunderstanding. She stood up from her stool and walked quickly away from the counter, taking my platinum card and my driver license with her. I stood at the counter and watched her walk toward the glass-enclosed office at the back of the lobby. The branch manager was an older man sitting behind a large mahogany desk. The teller walked in and pointed anxiously at her computer screen. The manager looked at the monitor, and his eyes widened in shock. He did not look at me. He immediately picked up his desk phone and began dialing rapidly. My logistics training screamed a massive warning in my mind. A bank manager does not call customer service for a conservatorship flag. He calls the authorities. He calls the legal contact listed on the file. He was calling my daughter or the local police to report that the confused, wandering elderly man had just walked into his lobby. The security guard near the front door suddenly put his coffee cup down and looked toward the manager office. The manager gestured subtly in my direction through the glass. The guard rested his hand near the radio on his belt. The physical trap was closing around me right in that very room. I did not panic. I did not shout or demand my identification back. I knew that creating a scene was exactly what they expected from a man losing his mind. I simply turned away from the counter. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my pace completely even. I walked toward the heavy glass doors with the casual purpose of a man who just remembered he left his reading glasses in his car. I did not run because running triggers a primal response in security personnel to give chase. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the freezing morning air. The moment I was outside, I took a sharp right turn and merged instantly into a large crowd of people waiting at a busy bus stop. I looked back through the bank window. The security guard was now rushing toward the teller counter, looking around the lobby in confusion. The branch manager was stepping out of his office with his phone still pressed tightly to his ear. I stepped onto a crowded city bus right as the doors were closing. I paid the fare with the loose change in my pocket and moved to the very back seat. I watched the bank disappear down the street as the bus pulled away. I had lost my identification and my credit cards, but I had kept my freedom. I was completely cut off from my old life, but the war had officially begun, and I knew exactly where to find my hidden ammunition. The city bus rattled heavily down the wide avenue, heading steadily toward the older industrial district of the city. I sat near the rear exit, keeping my head low and my wool collar pulled up high against the bitter morning chill. Every single time the bus slowed down at a red light or paused at a pedestrian crossing, my eyes instinctively scanned the busy sidewalks for police cruisers or private security vehicles. Natalie and Colin had successfully filed the fraudulent conservatorship paperwork, which meant they possessed the legal upper hand. My face and my physical description would soon be distributed to local law enforcement under the guise of a missing and mentally unstable elderly man. I watched the modern gleaming glass buildings of the financial district gradually give way to the weathered brick and mortar facades of the old downtown sector. This was a neglected part of the city that Colin and his wealthy developer friends completely ignored and actively despised. For that exact reason, it was the perfect place for me to disappear. I needed to reach a highly specific building that I had secured 3 years ago when the first warning signs began to flash. I exited the bus 3 stops early to avoid the main transit hub and walked the remaining distance through narrow service alleys and crowded public squares. I made absolutely sure to stay out of the direct line of sight of street cameras by weaving smoothly through the chaotic morning delivery crowds. My decades of logistics training kept my mind completely focused on the physical route, but the profound sting of my own daughter actively destroying my life still burned fiercely in my throat. I finally reached a massive windowless stone building that housed a private, secure storage facility. It was an aging establishment that catered exclusively to clients who valued absolute discretion and physical security over modern digital convenience. I pushed through the heavy solid brass doors and approached the polished wooden front desk. The clerk on duty was an older gentleman who simply nodded at me without asking a single unnecessary question. I reached into the hidden lining of my leather wallet and handed him a small brass key. I did not have to provide my state driver license or a standard credit card because this particular storage vault was rented under an anonymous corporate shell company I had established decades ago to manage discrete supply chain contracts. The clerk quietly checked the engraved key number against a thick paper ledger and guided me down a long, dimly lit hallway that smelled of floor wax and old paper. We entered a silent, cavernous room lined with hundreds of gleaming steel boxes stacked from the floor to the ceiling. He inserted his master lock, turned it with a heavy click, and stepped outside the room to provide me with complete privacy. I stood entirely alone in the quiet vault and took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I inserted my brass key, turned the mechanism, and pulled the heavy metal drawer from the steel wall. I carried the heavy metal box to a small wooden viewing table in the center of the room and lifted the lid. Inside lay the undeniable physical proof of my long-standing mistrust of my arrogant son-in-law. 3 years ago, I had noticed severe financial discrepancies in a minor commercial real estate project Colin had arrogantly asked me to review. I utilized my corporate contacts to dig deeper into his ledgers, and I uncovered a terrifying hidden pattern of reckless offshore gambling disguised entirely as aggressive property expansion. I knew right then that his entire financial foundation was built on sand, and it was only a matter of time before the crushing weight of his debts caused a total collapse. I also knew from years of corporate warfare that when a desperate, greedy man starts drowning, he will violently pull down anyone standing nearby to save himself. I had foolishly hoped my daughter would eventually see the terrible truth and leave him, but I had to prepare an exit strategy for the worst-case scenario. I had slowly and meticulously siphoned exactly $50,000 in completely untraceable cash out of my legitimate checking accounts over a period of 18 months. That life-saving money was now sitting directly in front of me, neatly banded in thick, tight stacks of crisp $100 bills. Resting right next to the stacks of cash was a valid secondary passport I had legally obtained through a dual citizenship program utilizing my late mother's European lineage. Resting directly on top of the dark blue passport was a prepaid cellular phone still securely sealed in its original rigid plastic packaging. I tore the thick plastic open with my hands and powered the small black device on. I had purchased this specific phone using cash at a remote convenience store to ensure that neither Colin nor the major telecom companies could ever trace my geographic location. I immediately connected to the secure building internet network and downloaded an encrypted messaging application. I knew Sylvia, the brave housekeeper, used this exact software to communicate safely with her relatives overseas. Sylvia was my only reliable inside source within that house, and I urgently needed to know the exact parameters of the legal attack Colin had launched against me. I took $10,000 in cash from the metal box and placed the banded stacks securely into the deep inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I left the remaining $40,000 and the secondary passport inside the vault as a final, unshakable contingency plan. I closed the metal lid, pushed the heavy drawer back into the solid steel wall, and locked it securely. I walked out of the stone building and merged back into the crowded, bustling city streets with a completely new and dangerous sense of power. I was no longer a confused, elderly man running blindly from a devastating family trap. I was fully funded, completely untraceable, and heavily armed with the truth. I found a quiet, isolated corner in a busy public park and sat down on a cold wooden bench. I held the prepaid phone tightly in my hands and prepared to send a message that would officially turn the tide of this war. I left the cold wooden bench in the park and blended back into the heavy flow of pedestrian traffic. My prepaid phone was secure in my pocket, but a tiny screen was not sufficient for the complex digital war I was about to wage against my own family. I needed a proper machine to review legal documents and move massive amounts of capital. I walked 4 blocks down the busy avenue to a sprawling discount electronics retailer. The store was massive and crowded with loud families and distracted teenagers. It was the perfect chaotic environment for a fugitive to make a completely anonymous purchase. I walked straight to the back aisle and picked out a cheap, heavy laptop encased in thick black plastic. It was not elegant, but it possessed the necessary processing power I required to navigate secure networks and manipulate financial accounts. I carried the heavy box to a tired-looking cashier and paid her with a stack of crisp $20 bills I had just broken from my fresh supply of emergency cash. She did not ask for my name or an email address or a phone number. She simply handed me a generic plastic bag and looked right past me to the next customer in line. I was a ghost purchasing the tools to haunt the people who tried to bury me. I carried my new equipment out of the store and walked to a busy public library 3 streets away. The reading room was vast and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. It was filled with college students wearing headphones and elderly citizens reading the morning newspapers. I chose a small wooden desk tucked securely in the very back corner of the room. I positioned my chair facing the main entrance so no one could possibly approach me unseen. I powered on the plastic laptop and immediately connected to the free public wireless network. My 40-year corporate career in global logistics had taught me exactly how to cover my digital tracks and move sensitive information without leaving a trail. I downloaded a secure virtual private network to completely mask my geographic location and installed the exact same encrypted messaging application I had placed on my burner phone. The interface glowed a pale blue against the dim light of the library corner. I carefully typed in the specific international phone number I knew Sylvia used to call her family in Central America. My fingers hovered over the plastic keyboard for a long, tense moment. Reaching out to her was an incredible risk. If Colin or Natalie had confiscated her phone, or if she panicked and told them I had contacted her, my entire tactical advantage would evaporate instantly. But logistics is ultimately about calculated risk, and Sylvia was the absolute only asset I had inside enemy lines. I typed a simple, careful message asking if she was safe and hit the send key. The agonizing wait began. I sat in the quiet library listening to the soft turning of pages and the distant, steady hum of the heating system. 5 minutes passed. Then 10 minutes passed. Every single second felt like a physical, concrete weight pressing down on my chest. I began to seriously doubt my judgment. I wondered if the corrupt doctor had locked her in a room to silence her, or if Colin had violently fired her for warning me on the driveway. Just as I reached out to close the laptop, the screen flashed bright green. A new message appeared from her hidden number. It simply said she was alone in the basement laundry room and asked if I was far away from the city. I typed back immediately confirming I was completely safe and entirely off the grid. The immense relief in her subsequent messages was palpable, even through the cold text on the computer screen. I asked her what happened after I drove away from the dark house last night. Sylvia typed rapidly, and her words painted a horrifying picture of the absolute monsters living inside that modern glass and steel house. She told me the 3 men in the unmarked van were furious when they realized I was not coming inside to spring their trap. She described how my daughter Natalie had paced the living room floor, screaming at Colin that their master plan was falling apart and that the bank would seize their assets by the end of the month. Sylvia explained that she had been working for them for 5 long years, and she had watched Colin transform from a greedy, arrogant businessman into a desperate, dangerous animal. She said Colin treated her like garbage, constantly threatening to report her work visa status to federal authorities if she did not work unpaid overtime every single weekend. But her motivation to help me went far deeper than simple personal revenge or anger. Sylvia had a father back in her home country who was exactly my age. She told me that watching Natalie actively plot to lock her own father in a psychiatric facility sickened her to her very core. She wrote that family is sacred, and what they were doing to me was an unforgivable sin against God. I felt a profound wave of gratitude for this brave, resilient woman. I asked her if she knew the specific legal strategy they were currently employing to seize my $4 million estate. Her response changed the entire trajectory of my survival plan. Sylvia told me that Colin had left a thick stack of legal folders on his home office desk that morning before rushing out to meet with his corporate lawyers. She had briefly looked at the top pages while cleaning his office. She confirmed my absolute worst fears. They were aggressively pushing an emergency medical conservatorship based entirely on forged psychiatric evaluations, claiming I suffered from violent wandering advanced dementia. The court hearing for full asset transfer was scheduled in exactly 14 days. I needed that specific paperwork. I needed to see exactly which lies the corrupt doctor had signed his name to, so I could systematically dismantle them in front of a judge. I asked Sylvia if she was willing to take a massive risk for me. I promised to compensate her generously and ensure Colin could never harm her immigration status again. I asked her to sneak into the office and take clear photographs of every single page inside that folder. The screen remained blank for a terrifying minute. I held my breath, praying I had not pushed her too far. Then the small typing indicator appeared again. She told me Colin and Natalie were currently at the courthouse filing the secondary motions, and the house was completely empty. She told me to wait and keep my screen open. I sat back in the hard wooden library chair and stared at the glowing monitor. I had successfully recruited my inside source, and the counterattack was officially underway. I stared at the glowing screen of the cheap plastic laptop. The public library was completely quiet, but the silence felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. Every passing second felt like an hour. I knew the immense danger Sylvia was placing herself in. If Colin returned home to retrieve a forgotten file and caught her inside his private office, her life would be completely ruined. He would deport her or frame her for theft. My hands rested on the table, trembling slightly, not from age but from the sheer adrenaline coursing through my veins. I kept my eyes fixed on the blank application interface, waiting for a sign that she was still safe. Suddenly, the encrypted application blinked green. A notification appeared. It was an image file. Then another appeared, then a third. Sylvia was working with incredible speed. I clicked on the first photograph, and the image expanded across my screen. The picture was slightly blurry at the edges, taken hastily with a trembling hand, but the bold black text in the center was perfectly legible. It was the official letterhead of the corrupt private physician I had seen stepping out of the unmarked van the night before. I zoomed in on the document and read the lies they had manufactured to destroy me. The medical evaluation was a masterpiece of legal fiction. The doctor claimed he had been treating me for advanced cognitive decline over the past 6 months. He wrote that I suffered from severe paranoia, violent outbursts, and an inability to recognize my own family members. He stated that I frequently wandered the streets at night, putting myself and others in immediate physical danger. He even fabricated specific dates, claiming Natalie had brought me to his clinic, crying and begging for help after finding me lost miles from my home. The document concluded with his professional medical opinion that I was entirely incapable of managing my financial affairs or making basic life decisions. He strongly recommended an immediate and permanent conservatorship to be granted to my loving daughter Natalie. Reading those words felt like taking a physical blow to the stomach. They had not just stolen my money. They were actively erasing my entire identity. They were painting a portrait of a broken, pathetic old man who needed to be locked away in a padded room for his own safety. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was signed and dated late yesterday afternoon. They had finalized my prison sentence before they even picked up the telephone to invite me to their fake dinner. The screen flashed again. Sylvia sent another batch of photographs. These were not medical records. They were the formal legal petitions filed by Colin and his aggressive corporate attorneys. I read the cold calculating language requesting the immediate transfer of all my assets. They listed my bank accounts, my retirement funds, and the complete deed to my $4 million estate. The petition requested these assets be moved directly into a trust controlled entirely by Colin. They cited his vast business experience as the primary reason he should manage my wealth, while my daughter focused on my medical care. It was a perfectly executed hostile takeover, disguised as a tragic family medical emergency. They had mapped out every single dollar I owned. Then I saw the final photograph. It was a stamped notice from the county courthouse. It was the official hearing date for the finalization of the permanent conservatorship. The judge had granted an emergency temporary hold on my accounts based on the doctor evaluation, but the final binding decree required a formal hearing. The date printed at the top of the page was exactly 14 days from today. I had exactly 2 weeks, 14 days to dismantle a lie backed by a licensed medical professional, a team of corporate lawyers, and my own flesh and blood. If I walked into a police station today, I would be handed over to the hospital. If I did nothing, I would be legally erased in 2 weeks. The legal system is a massive grinding machine that does not care about the truth. It only cares about the paperwork. Colin had all the paperwork. He had built a massive invisible wall around my life, and he believed I was completely trapped inside it. Another message popped up on the screen. Sylvia typed that she heard a car pulling into the driveway. She wrote that she was locking the office and going back to the basement laundry room right now. I quickly typed a message telling her to delete the application from her phone immediately and to act completely normal. I told her I had everything I needed and that she had just saved my life. I watched the green light next to her name blink out. She was gone and she was safe. I closed the image files and sat back in the hard wooden chair. The terror I had felt earlier that morning was completely gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculated fury. Colin thought he was a brilliant predator playing a game with a weak old man. But he had made the ultimate mistake. He had given me a concrete timeline, and he had left his entire strategy exposed on his desk. He forgot that I spent 40 years identifying weaknesses in complex supply chain systems and tearing them down. I powered down the laptop and slid it carefully back into the generic plastic bag. I walked out of the quiet library and stepped back onto the busy city streets. I had the evidence. I had the timeline. Now I needed to summon the one man who knew exactly how to turn Colin legal trap into a permanent financial tomb. I left the public library and walked purposefully toward the central train station. I needed to leave the city limits to find the one man capable of turning Colin's legal trap into a permanent financial tomb. His name was Anthony. We had worked together for 30 years at the global shipping firm. Anthony was the senior corporate counsel. He was a brilliant and utterly ruthless attorney who treated contract law like a blood sport. 15 years ago, he made a catastrophic personal mistake that nearly sent him to federal prison and ruined his entire family. I discovered the accounting error before the federal auditors did. I quietly restructured the supply chain accounts to absorb the financial impact and gave him the chance to fix his life without destroying his legacy. He retired 5 years ago to a quiet farmhouse 50 miles north of the city. He told me on his very last day at the firm that if I ever needed a weapon, I only had to knock on his door. I bought a paper ticket with physical cash and boarded the northbound commuter train. The rhythmic clacking of the heavy steel wheels against the tracks matched the cold, calculated beating of my heart. I arrived at a small rural station just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the tree line. I walked 2 miles down a quiet dirt road until I reached his property. The farmhouse was isolated and perfectly maintained. I walked up the wooden steps and knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. Anthony opened it almost immediately. He had aged, but his eyes were just as sharp and unyielding as they were in the corporate boardroom. He looked at my cheap plastic bag and my tired, tailored suit. He stepped aside without a single word and motioned for me to come inside. We sat down at his massive reclaimed wood dining table. He poured 2 glasses of black coffee. I did not waste time with pleasantries or apologies for showing up unannounced. I pulled the cheap plastic laptop from the generic bag and powered it on. I opened the digital photographs Sylvia had taken of the forged medical documents and the court petitions. I turned the glowing screen toward him. I told him my daughter and her husband were actively trying to erase my existence to steal my $4 million estate. Anthony put on his reading glasses and leaned forward. He read the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation in absolute silence. He read the petition for full asset transfer and the scheduled court date. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. He did not offer me empty sympathy. He knew I did not travel all this way for a shoulder to cry on. He took off his glasses and looked at me with a cold, calculating stare. He stated that the legal strategy was aggressive but extremely sloppy. He noted that Colin was rushing the process and relying entirely on the shock value of the emergency medical hold to bypass standard asset verification. I told Anthony we had exactly 14 days before the final conservatorship hearing. I needed him to find out why Colin was moving with such desperate, reckless speed. A man like Colin usually plays the long game, but this was the frantic, terrified move of a drowning man. Anthony stood up and walked into his home office. I followed him into a room lined entirely with heavy law books and multiple computer monitors. He sat down at his large mahogany desk and began typing rapidly. He explained that although he was officially retired, he still maintained active backdoor access to several elite financial databases and real estate registries. He needed to track exactly where Colin was bleeding money to understand the timeline of the attack. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Then he stopped completely. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let out a low, sharp breath. He told me he had found the true motive. He pulled up a complex financial ledger on the main screen. He explained that Colin had completely defaulted on a massive commercial development project 3 months ago. The traditional banks had entirely cut him off and flagged his company for high-risk insolvency. To keep his business from immediate bankruptcy, Colin had turned to a shadow lender. He had secured a predatory high-interest bridge loan from a ruthless private equity firm known for liquidating assets and destroying vulnerable borrowers. The principal amount of the loan was exactly $3 million. Anthony pointed to the collateral line on the digital contract. Colin had pledged my entire $4 million estate to secure the cash. He had forged my signature on the preliminary application 2 weeks ago. But the private equity firm was not stupid. They required a legally binding title transfer before they would actually release the $3 million into Colin's corporate account. That was the real reason for the fake dinner and the forged dementia diagnosis. Colin needed the emergency conservatorship to legally sign the deed over to the firm because he could not forge a notarized property transfer on his own. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. My own daughter was willing to lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life so her husband could pay off a shadow lender and save his failing reputation. Anthony printed the loan documents and laid them across the desk. He explained the immense danger of our current situation. The private equity firm was a collection of legal sharks. If the judge granted the conservatorship in exactly 14 days, Colin would immediately authorize the deed transfer. The firm would take legal ownership of my house and release the funds to Colin. Even if I eventually fought my way out of the hospital and proved the conservatorship was fraudulent, years later, my house would be gone forever. The firm would have acquired it legally through a court-appointed conservator, and the law would protect their claim. I asked Anthony what our defensive strategy should be. I wanted to know how to alert the authorities and stop the loan from going through before the court date. Anthony looked down at the printed documents, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He looked at me and stated clearly that we were not going to play defense. He said stopping the loan would only cause Colin to panic and find another violent way to attack my life. We needed to let Colin think he had won. We needed to let him finalize the loan and take the $3 million from the private equity firm. I stared at him in complete confusion. I asked him how we could possibly survive giving a shadow lender the deed to my home. Anthony tapped a specific clause in the thick stack of papers. He reminded me of the old family trust I had established before my wife passed away, the trust that currently held the legal deed to my property. He said Colin had made a fatal, arrogant assumption about how that specific trust operated. We were going to use that assumption to build a financial guillotine, and we were going to let Colin pull the lever himself. I sat across from Anthony in his dimly lit home office and stared at the loan documents he had just printed. My mind was struggling to process the sheer audacity of his proposed plan. For the past 24 hours, I had been running like a terrified fugitive from my own family. I had been hiding in cheap motels and communicating through encrypted channels just to survive. Now the brilliant and ruthless corporate attorney sitting in front of me was suggesting we willingly hand over the keys to the castle. I looked at Anthony and told him I needed to understand exactly how giving a shadow lender the legal right to my $4 million estate was going to save my life. I told him that if we let Colin finalize this fraudulent $3 million loan using my house as collateral, the private equity firm would eventually evict me and auction off my property to the highest bidder. Anthony leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let out a deep, rumbling laugh that sounded entirely out of place in the tense room. He took off his reading glasses and looked at me with the cold, sharp eyes of a man who had spent his entire life destroying corrupt executives in the courtroom. He told me I was thinking like a victim. He said I was looking at the physical house instead of looking at the invisible legal architecture built underneath it. Anthony pointed a thick finger at the collateral signature line on the loan application, where Colin had confidently forged my name. He asked me to think back 30 years to the day my late wife and I first purchased the estate. My wife was a deeply practical and fiercely protective woman. When we bought the property, she insisted we hire a specialized estate lawyer to draft a highly specific, revocable living trust. She wanted to ensure that if anything ever happened to us, the house would be protected from standard probate courts and external creditors. I told Anthony I remembered signing the trust documents, but I had not looked at them in decades. I assumed the trust simply meant the house belonged to me until I died, and then it would automatically pass to my daughter Natalie. Anthony nodded slowly and smiled. He explained that Colin had made the exact same amateur assumption. Colin pulled the public county records, saw my name associated with the property, and assumed I owned the estate as a private individual. But I did not own the estate. The trust owned the estate. I was merely the appointed managing trustee. Anthony opened a secure portal on his computer and pulled up the original digital charter of my family trust. He turned the monitor toward me and highlighted a massive, dense paragraph buried deep in the 7th section of the charter. He told me to read the clause out loud. I leaned forward and read the legal jargon. The text stated that the acting trustee possessed the absolute power to pledge the assets of the trust for commercial loans, but it contained a massive, irrevocable condition. Any commercial debt secured by the trust property automatically and permanently attached its full financial liability to the individual or corporate entity receiving the actual loan funds. The trust itself acted only as a theoretical guarantor, but completely indemnified the physical real estate from active seizure. I stopped reading and looked up at Anthony. The sheer brilliance of my late wife's legal foresight hit me like a physical shockwave. I asked Anthony to translate the legal terminology into plain English. He leaned over the mahogany desk, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper. He explained that Colin was attempting to borrow $3 million from a ruthless private equity firm using my house as the guarantee. Colin believed that if he failed to pay the money back, the firm would simply take my house and Colin would walk away entirely free with the stolen cash. But the trust document completely reversed that dynamic. Anthony stated that we were going to execute a highly specialized maneuver called a trustee subordination. We were going to officially notify the private equity firm that the acting trustee of the estate fully recognized and legally approved the $3 million collateral pledge. I felt a sudden spike of panic and asked Anthony why we would actively approve a loan based on forged signatures and a fake dementia diagnosis. I told him that approving the loan would give them exactly what they wanted. Anthony slammed his hand down on the desk in absolute excitement. He told me that was the entire point of the trap. He said the private equity firm did not care about my health or my forged signature. They only cared about securing a legally binding guarantee for their money. If I actively approved the loan as the legal trustee, the firm would bypass the entire messy conservatorship process. They would immediately release the $3 million directly into Colin's corporate bank account today. Colin would think he had completely won. He would think his fake dinner and his corrupt doctor had successfully frightened me into silent submission. But the moment those funds landed in his account, the trap would violently snap shut. Anthony explained the devastating second half of the trustee subordination. By officially approving the loan through the specific framework of my family trust, we were legally activating the indemnification clause. The moment Colin accepted the $3 million, the entire liability of the debt would permanently detach from my physical property and bind itself directly to Colin Personal Holding Company. I sat back in my chair, completely stunned by the magnitude of the legal weapon Anthony had just constructed. I asked him to clarify the exact sequence of events. I needed to be absolutely certain I understood the consequences. Anthony walked me through the timeline step by step. He said, first, we draft the trustee subordination document right here in this office. Second, we electronically file it with the state registry and officially transmit it to the private equity lenders. Third, the lenders see the absolute legal approval from the verified trustee, and they immediately wire the $3 million to Colin. Fourth, Colin receives the money and believes his failing real estate empire is saved. Then Anthony paused, and a dark shadow crossed his face. He said the fifth step is where the absolute ruin begins. He explained that a trustee subordination legally reclassifies the nature of the debt. It instantly transforms the loan from a standard real estate mortgage into a hyper-aggressive, unsecured corporate liability. The private equity firm would immediately receive an automated legal notification that their collateral was no longer the physical $4 million estate, but rather the total sum of Colin's existing corporate assets. I realized exactly what that meant. Colin was already bankrupt. He had no liquid corporate assets. His entire company was completely hollow. When the ruthless shadow lenders realized they had just handed $3 million to a bankrupt developer, and that my house was legally untouchable, they would instantly trigger a default penalty. They would not come after me. They would tear Colin apart. They would seize his business accounts, his luxury vehicles, his personal home, and every single dime he and my daughter possessed. We were not just stopping his theft. We were legally handing him the rope to hang himself and letting him tie the knot. I looked at Anthony and asked the most important question. I asked him what would happen to Natalie. She was my only child. Despite the monstrous betrayal she had orchestrated, a small, fragile part of my heart still hesitated at the thought of her complete financial destruction. I asked Anthony if this maneuver would send her to prison. Anthony looked at me with a profound, somber understanding. He told me he could not control what the private equity firm would do when they realized Colin had defrauded them. He reminded me that Natalie had actively plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. She had hired a corrupt doctor to falsely diagnose me with advanced dementia. She had stood in my driveway, preparing to watch me get strapped to a gurney against my will. Anthony stated clearly that I was not destroying her life. I was simply refusing to let her destroy mine. He said the legal maneuver we were about to execute was entirely lawful. We were just removing the protective shield I had provided for them over the last 5 years and letting them face the terrifying reality of the real world. The hesitation in my chest completely vanished. The daughter I had raised was gone. She had been entirely consumed by greed and arrogance. I reached across the heavy mahogany desk and told Anthony to draft the documents. For the next 2 hours, the office was filled with the rapid sound of Anthony typing and printing massive stacks of complex legal paperwork. He drafted the formal trustee subordination. He cross-referenced the original family trust charter. He prepared the official electronic transmission codes for the state registry and the private equity firm. He operated with the terrifying precision of a master surgeon removing a toxic tumor. When he finally finished, he placed a thick stack of papers in front of me. He handed me a heavy silver pen. He told me that once I signed these pages, the entire financial landscape would permanently shift. Colin would receive his money, but he would unknowingly inherit a catastrophic unpayable debt that would annihilate his entire existence. I did not hesitate. I did not let my hand tremble. I thought about Sylvia risking her life to warn me on the freezing driveway. I thought about the men waiting in the dark living room with leather restraints. I pressed the silver pen to the paper and signed my name with absolute perfect clarity. The silent adjustment was officially in motion, and there was absolutely no turning back. I left Anthony and his quiet farmhouse late in the evening. The legal trap was completely armed, but the waiting period was the most dangerous phase of any conflict. I navigated the dark country roads back toward the outer edge of the city. I found a different motel much further away from the main transit lines and the affluent suburbs. I paid the clerk in cash, took the physical metal key, and locked the heavy wooden door of my room. I needed to rest, but my mind was operating at a dangerous speed. The trustee subordination document was officially moving through the state registry channels. Colin would receive his approval soon. But I knew my son-in-law well enough to know he would not simply wait patiently for the paperwork to clear. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are utterly unpredictable. I woke up early the next morning and walked across the empty street to a small local diner. I needed black coffee and a moment of quiet to plan my exact physical movements for the next 14 days. I sat in a faded vinyl booth facing the kitchen, keeping my back toward the large glass windows. The diner was mostly empty except for a few truck drivers and a tired waitress. A small television was mounted in the top corner of the room, playing the local morning news cycle. The volume was low, blending into the sound of clattering plates and sizzling bacon. I was taking a slow sip of my coffee when the anchor voice suddenly cut through the background noise. I heard my own full name broadcast across the room. I looked up at the television and the blood completely froze in my veins. A large, high-resolution photograph of my face filled the entire screen. It was a picture taken at Natalie's wedding 5 years ago. I was wearing a tuxedo and smiling proudly. Below my face, a bright red banner crawled slowly across the bottom of the screen. The text read, "Urgent missing vulnerable adult." The camera cut away from the news studio and showed a live press conference taking place on the front steps of the downtown police precinct. My daughter stood behind a cluster of microphones. Colin stood right beside her with his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, playing the perfect role of the supportive and protective husband. Natalie was crying. It was not a fake forced sob or a dry, mechanical performance. It was a terrifyingly convincing display of absolute grief. She held a tissue to her face and spoke to the reporters with a trembling, desperate voice. She told the cameras that her beloved father had been suffering from severe and rapid cognitive decline over the past 6 months. She lied to the entire city with breathtaking ease. She said I had become increasingly paranoid, confused, and prone to violent outbursts. She told the reporters that I was supposed to come to their house for a quiet family dinner, but I never arrived. She claimed she and her husband had searched the neighborhood and found my car abandoned down the street from their estate. I realized immediately why she was telling that specific lie. She was establishing a false public timeline to prove I was wandering aimlessly in a state of advanced dementia. She reached into her purse and pulled out the forged medical evaluation from the corrupt doctor. She waved the official-looking document in front of the flashing cameras like a tragic flag. She begged the public to help find me before I wandered into highway traffic or froze to death in the winter cold. She pleaded with the viewers to call the emergency police line immediately if they saw an elderly man looking lost, disoriented, or frightened. I sat in the diner booth, completely paralyzed by the sheer malicious brilliance of her strategy. She was actively weaponizing the empathy of the public to execute her hostile financial takeover. She was using the local police department and the media as her personal hunting dogs. The danger of my situation multiplied exponentially in that single moment. The police genuinely believed they were looking for a helpless, sick old man who needed emergency medical intervention. If a patrol car spotted me walking down the street, they would not stop to ask me questions or listen to my side of the story. They would put me in the back of an ambulance for my own safety. They would deliver me directly into the hands of the corrupt psychiatrist waiting at his private clinic. The doctor would pump me full of chemical sedatives and lock me in a secure ward. The conservatorship trap I had just legally bypassed with Anthony was now hunting me physically on the streets. I looked around the small diner with a sudden crushing sense of claustrophobia. There were 4 other customers sitting at the counter. Any one of them could look up at the television screen and then look over at my booth. I was wearing the exact same tailored wool coat I wore every single day. I was no longer an anonymous older man running morning errands. I was a high-priority local news story. I carefully placed a $20 bill on the table, pulled my coat collar up high around my neck, and slid out of the booth. I kept my head down and walked out of the diner before the waitress could return to pour more coffee. I walked quickly back to my motel room. Every passing car felt like a potential threat. Every siren echoing in the distance made the muscles in my chest tighten. I realized that my physical movement was now entirely compromised. I could not go to a bank to withdraw more funds. I could not check into a proper hotel. I could not even walk into a grocery store without risking someone recognizing my face from the morning news cycle. They had effectively trapped me in a tiny, invisible prison of extreme paranoia. The entire city was looking for me, and they all believed they would be heroes for turning me in. I locked the door of my motel room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall. The psychological toll of the betrayal stung deeper than any physical wound. My only child was standing in front of cameras, crying tears she had manufactured to steal the house I had built to protect her. She was willing to destroy my freedom to save her husband failing real estate empire. The logistics director inside my mind coldly analyzed the board. Colin and Natalie were applying maximum pressure to flush me out. They needed to physically locate me before the court date to solidify the illusion of my mental incompetence and secure the deed transfer for the shadow lenders. But I also realized their public panic meant our counterattack was already working. They were acting out of sheer terror because Colin needed the physical property to secure his $3 million private equity loan. The shadow lenders were likely demanding immediate proof of the collateral. Colin was completely running out of time. If he could not produce me or the legally transferred deed, his entire business would collapse under the weight of his hidden debts. I needed to use their absolute desperation against them. I needed to give them exactly what they were looking for, but on my own strict terms. I could not hide in a cheap motel room for the next 14 days waiting to be discovered by a maid or a passing police officer. I had to make a move that would completely convince Colin and Natalie that I was defeated and fleeing the country. I had to create a distraction so massive and undeniable that they would call off the local police search and focus their greed in the entirely wrong direction. I sat in the dim motel room and formulated the next phase of the operation. Colin and Natalie had weaponized the local media and the police department to hunt me down. I could not hide in the shadows for 2 weeks waiting for the court date. I needed to blind them with their own greed. I needed to make them believe that the $4 million prize was slipping right through their fingers and crossing international borders. I opened the heavy plastic laptop and connected to the encrypted wireless network. I navigated directly to the website of a major international airline. I did not use a fake name or a hidden proxy server. I wanted them to see exactly what I was doing. I booked a one-way first-class ticket to Geneva, Switzerland. The destination was not chosen at random. Switzerland represented the ultimate financial fortress. It was the absolute perfect psychological trigger for a man like Colin, who was desperately trying to steal my wealth. If he believed I was flying to Geneva, he would instantly assume I was moving my entire estate into an untouchable offshore banking system. I entered my real passport number and my personal frequent flyer credentials. I paid for the exorbitant $10,000 ticket using a primary credit card that I knew Colin had been actively monitoring. I hit the confirm button and watched the digital receipt appear on the screen. The trap was baited. But a digital footprint was not enough. Colin was paranoid, and he would verify the physical reality of the flight. I needed a physical decoy to walk through the airport and complete the illusion. I packed my few belongings and left the motel. I took a city bus to a struggling industrial neighborhood on the south side of town. I walked into a crowded community center where older men gathered to stay out of the freezing cold. I sat at a long plastic table and observed the room. I found exactly who I was looking for. He was a man roughly my age and my exact physical build. He looked tired and worn down by the world. I sat across from him and introduced myself simply as a man who needed a massive favor. I placed a thick banded stack of $1,000 in crisp new bills on the table. The man stared at the money with wide eyes. I told him the money was his if he agreed to do a very simple and completely legal job for me. I opened my bag and pulled out my signature tailored wool coat and the dark gray fedora I wore every single winter. I told him I needed him to put on my clothes, take a printed boarding pass, and walk through the international terminal of the city airport. I instructed him to simply walk up to the first-class security checkpoint and then turn around and walk away before passing through the metal detectors. I assured him he was not breaking any laws and that he was simply helping a wealthy man play a prank on greedy relatives. The man looked at the cash and then looked at the coat. He nodded slowly and put the coat on. It fit him perfectly. We took a taxi to the massive international transit hub. I paid the driver in cash, and we stepped out into the chaotic drop-off lane. The airport was a massive, sprawling complex of glass and steel filled with thousands of rushing travelers. It was the perfect environment for a misdirection. I handed the man the printed boarding pass and reminded him of his exact instructions. I watched him walk through the sliding glass doors and merge into the massive crowd. I did not follow him inside. I walked to a multi-level parking garage across the street and took the elevator to the fourth-floor viewing deck. I had a perfect unobstructed view of the international departure gates and the main drop-off lanes. I pulled out my burner phone and checked the encrypted messages from Sylvia. The timing was absolutely flawless. Sylvia sent a message saying chaos had just erupted inside the glass and steel house. The automated alert from my primary credit card had hit Colin's personal phone exactly as he and Natalie were sitting down with their corporate lawyers. Sylvia wrote that Colin completely lost his mind. He screamed that I was fleeing the country and moving the assets to a Swiss bank. Natalie began to panic, crying that the police search was too slow and that they were going to lose the $3 million private equity loan. They completely abandoned their legal strategy session. They ran out of the house and jumped into Colin's luxury vehicle. They were racing toward the airport to physically intercept me before the flight took off. I stood on the cold concrete of the parking garage and watched the highway exit ramp leading to the airport terminals. 20 minutes later, a sleek black sports car came violently swerving through the traffic and slammed to a halt in the illegal drop-off zone. Colin and Natalie jumped out of the car, leaving the doors wide open and the engine running. An airport security officer immediately began yelling at them, but they completely ignored him. They sprinted wildly through the sliding glass doors and disappeared into the terminal. I could picture the exact sequence of events unfolding inside the building. Colin and Natalie were running frantically through the massive crowds, desperately scanning the faces of every older man they passed. They were sweating and breathing heavily, completely consumed by the terror of losing their stolen fortune. They would push past families and business travelers, rushing blindly toward the first-class international security gates. Then they would see him. They would see the familiar tailored wool coat and the dark gray fedora standing near the ticketing counters. They would feel a massive surge of triumphant adrenaline. Colin would run up behind the man and aggressively grab him by the shoulder, expecting to see my terrified face. Instead, the man would turn around and look at them with complete confusion. Colin and Natalie would stare at the face of an absolute stranger wearing my clothes. The psychological devastation of that single moment would be absolute. They would realize they had been completely outsmarted. They would look up at the massive digital departure boards and see the flight to Geneva officially boarding. They would stand in the middle of the crowded terminal, paralyzed by the horrifying realization that their prey was gone and their money was flying across the Atlantic Ocean. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was another message from Sylvia. She said the local police department had just called the house looking for Natalie. The police were furious because Natalie had missed a scheduled press update, and they were threatening to drop the missing persons case due to lack of family cooperation. Colin and Natalie had completely ruined their own false narrative. By abandoning the police to chase the money, they proved to the authorities that they were not grieving, concerned relatives. They were just greedy heirs chasing a paycheck. I watched from the parking garage as Colin and Natalie slowly walked back out of the terminal. Their posture was completely broken. Natalie was covering her face with her hands, and Colin was staring blankly at the ground. The arrogant, aggressive predators had been reduced to terrified, empty shells. They got back into their illegally parked car and drove slowly away from the airport. The physical hunt was officially over. They would no longer search the city streets or the local motels. They believed I was gone, and they believed the money was gone. They were now completely isolated and vulnerable. The distraction had worked perfectly. I had bought myself the time and the absolute freedom I needed to execute the final blow. I turned away from the viewing deck and walked back toward the city transit station. The trustee subordination document was waiting for Colin and his shadow lenders. The private equity loan was about to be approved. I walked into the shadows of the city with a cold, profound sense of peace. The trap was set, and the rats were finally running directly toward the poison. Inside the sprawling glass and steel house, the atmosphere was suffocating. Colin and Natalie had returned from the airport completely defeated. They walked through their massive front door and collapsed onto their expensive leather sofa. The silence in the living room was absolute. They believed their prey had escaped across the Atlantic Ocean, taking their financial salvation with him. Colin stared blindly at the wall, his arrogant facade shattered by the terrifying reality of his impending bankruptcy. He had lied to the local police, he had alienated his corporate lawyers, and he had failed to secure the physical body of the man he needed to lock away. He was waiting for the ruthless shadow lenders to call his phone and demand the immediate liquidation of his commercial real estate portfolio. But Colin did not understand the brilliant, devastating nature of the legal machinery Anthony and I had set into motion. As Colin sat on the sofa, sweating through his designer shirt, his mobile phone suddenly began to ring. He looked at the caller identification screen, and his breath hitched in his throat. It was the senior underwriter for the private equity firm. Colin hesitated for a long, terrifying moment. He braced himself for the screaming threats and the absolute cancellation of the bridge loan. He slowly pressed the answer button and brought the phone to his ear with a trembling hand. The voice on the other end of the line did not scream. The underwriter sounded completely calm and incredibly pleased. He informed Colin that the legal department had just received an electronic transmission from the state registry. The underwriter stated that the required collateral pledge had been fully authorized and legally verified by the acting trustee of the estate. Colin sat completely frozen. His mind struggled to comprehend the words he was hearing. He stuttered into the phone, asking how the approval could possibly be valid if the physical property owner had fled the country. The underwriter laughed a cold, mechanical laugh. He told Colin that the private equity firm did not care about missing persons reports. They only cared about legally binding signatures, and the state registry had just processed a flawless absolute authorization. The underwriter confirmed that the conservatorship process was no longer necessary. The shadow lenders had the legal guarantee they demanded. He told Colin that the $3 million bridge loan was officially approved, and the funds were currently being prepared for immediate wire transfer. The call disconnected, leaving Colin sitting in the quiet living room, holding the phone in absolute shock. For 10 seconds, he did not move a single muscle. Then a massive, euphoric smile spread across his face. He jumped off the leather sofa and let out a loud, triumphant shout that echoed against the high, vaulted ceilings of his empty house. Natalie rushed into the room asking what had happened. Colin grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her with frantic, manic energy. He told her they had won. He told her my sudden disappearance had actually saved them from a long, messy court battle. He arrogantly assumed that in my panicked rush to flee the country, I had somehow triggered an automatic approval through the old family trust out of sheer incompetence. He believed he was the smartest man in the world. He believed his aggressive tactics had terrified an old man into making a fatal legal mistake. Colin walked over to his massive wet bar and pulled out a bottle of imported single malt scotch. He poured 2 large glasses and handed one to his wife. They clinked the heavy crystal together, celebrating the theft of my life savings. Colin paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, completely consumed by his own hubris. He loudly bragged to Natalie about how he was going to use the $3 million to crush his commercial rivals. He talked about resuming construction on his stalled strip malls and buying out the competitors who had mocked his recent financial struggles. He completely dismissed the fact that he had tried to lock his own father-in-law in a psychiatric ward just 24 hours prior. In his mind, the ends entirely justified the malicious means. He was a predator who had successfully hunted his prey, and he was already planning his next conquest. He walked into his home office and sat down in his heavy ergonomic chair. He powered on his massive curved desktop monitor and opened the secure portal for his primary corporate bank account. Natalie stood right behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders and staring intently at the screen. The bank account currently showed a pathetic negative balance, a terrifying testament to his chronic mismanagement. Colin clicked the refresh button. The screen loaded for a brief, agonizing second. The balance remained negative. He took a slow, confident sip of his expensive scotch, completely unfazed by the delay. He knew international wire transfers could take a few minutes to process through the Federal Reserve clearinghouses. He waited exactly 3 minutes and clicked the refresh button a second time. The loading icon spun in a small circle. Then the entire screen flashed bright white. The red negative numbers completely vanished. In their place appeared a massive glowing green line of text. The current available balance now read $3 million. The private equity funds had officially landed. The money was sitting directly in his corporate account, completely liquid and ready to be deployed. Colin leaned back in his chair and laughed a deep, cruel laugh. He reached up and held his wife's hand, believing they were now completely untouchable. They had the money, they had the power, and they believed the old man was permanently out of the picture. They were basking in the warm, glowing light of a total victory. But they were completely blind to the reality of their situation. They did not realize that the $3 million resting in their account was not a lifeline. It was an explosive device, and the timer had just reached 0. Colin did not waste a single second admiring the massive number glowing on his computer screen. The $3 million from the private equity firm was exactly what he needed to pull his commercial real estate business out of the grave, but it was only useful if he moved it immediately. He had contractors threatening to walk off job sites and creditors preparing to file public lawsuits by the end of the week. He quickly navigated to the commercial wire transfer portal on his banking interface. He selected his 3 most aggressive creditors and typed in the exact amounts required to pay off his most delinquent accounts. He wanted to silence his critics today. He typed with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he had just outsmarted everyone in his life. Natalie stood behind him, resting her chin on his shoulder, watching the screen with eager anticipation. Colin took a deep breath, smiled, and pressed the final submission button to authorize the massive wire transfers. He expected to see the familiar green checkmark indicating the funds were successfully routed through the federal clearing system. Instead, the entire banking interface froze for a terrifying 5 seconds. The screen suddenly flashed a brilliant angry red. A large warning box appeared in the very center of the monitor, displaying a critical system error code. The text below the code stated that the transaction could not be completed because the primary account was currently under a severe institutional restriction. Colin let out a frustrated sigh. He did not feel panic yet. He simply felt the deep annoyance of an arrogant man inconvenienced by corporate bureaucracy. He told Natalie that the bank automated security system had likely flagged the sudden $3 million deposit as suspicious activity. He picked up his mobile phone and dialed the exclusive concierge number for his elite corporate banking tier. He fully expected to yell at a customer service representative for 5 minutes and have the account instantly unlocked. The call connected after 3 short rings. A polite representative answered and asked for his secure identification phrase. Colin provided it and then aggressively demanded that the security hold on his account be lifted immediately. He loudly explained that he was finalizing critical commercial construction payments and that their automated system was costing him valuable time. The representative typed on her keyboard for a moment. Then the line went completely silent. When the woman finally spoke again, her polite customer service tone was completely gone. Her voice was cold and rigidly professional. She informed Colin that she was not authorized to view the details of his account restriction. She stated that she was required to transfer his call directly to the Federal Compliance and Legal Department. Before Colin could even ask a question, the line clicked and hold music began to play. The first cold drop of real terror finally hit the bottom of his stomach. A man with a deep, serious voice picked up the line. He identified himself as a senior compliance officer for the bank. Colin tried to maintain his arrogant posture, demanding to know why his funds were locked. The compliance officer did not apologize. He stated clearly that the bank had not placed the restriction on the account. The restriction was a direct external mandate. The officer explained that less than an hour ago, the bank received an emergency asset freeze order directly from the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Colin felt the blood drain completely from his face. He gripped the edge of his heavy mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white. He asked the officer what possible reason the federal government would have to freeze a legitimate commercial development account. The compliance officer read from a prepared legal statement. He informed Colin that a highly detailed anonymous whistleblower report had been submitted to federal authorities earlier that week. The report contained irrefutable documented evidence of massive corporate tax evasion, fraudulent offshore wire transfers, and intentional misrepresentation of commercial assets over the past 3 years. The federal authorities had quietly verified the evidence and secured an immediate injunction to freeze every single financial account associated with Colin and his personal holding company. The full devastating reality of the trap slammed into Colin with the force of a speeding train. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. The whistleblower had not just submitted a vague complaint. Whoever orchestrated this attack knew exactly how long it would take for the federal freeze to be processed. They had timed the drop of the IRS hammer to perfectly coincide with the arrival of the private equity funds. The anonymous source had waited until the $3 million legally crossed the digital threshold into Colin's account before slamming the federal door shut. Colin realized he was not just dealing with an angry retired father-in-law. He was dealing with a master tactician who possessed a terrifying level of corporate legal knowledge. He did not know Anthony by name, but he felt the invisible crushing grip of the ruthless attorney closing around his throat. Anthony had weaponized Colin's own greed against him. By approving the private equity loan through the family trust, we had forced Colin to accept the money directly into his own tainted corporate ecosystem. The physical hemorrhage of his life began right there in the home office. Colin stared blankly at the red error message on his screen. The $3 million from the private equity firm was now permanently locked inside an account controlled entirely by federal tax investigators. The government would seize every single penny of that money to cover the years of unpaid taxes and massive fraud penalties he owed them. But the absolute horror of the situation went far beyond the frozen bank account. Colin had just borrowed $3 million from a shadow lender known for using ruthless, violent tactics to collect their debts. And because of the trustee subordination document, he had unwittingly accepted the private equity firm no longer held a claim against my $4 million physical estate. The private equity firm held a direct, unsecured claim against Colin personally. He had literally borrowed millions of dollars from dangerous men and handed it straight to the federal government. He owed the private equity firm a fortune he could never access, and he had absolutely no collateral left to offer them. Natalie noticed the absolute terror completely consuming her husband. She grabbed his arm and asked him what the bank manager had said. Colin dropped his phone onto the desk. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, and he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He looked at the daughter who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward to save this pathetic empire. He opened his mouth, but he could not form the words to tell her that their entire lives were completely over. They had nothing left. The money was gone, the business was dead, and the true predators were already walking to the door. Anthony sat across from me in his quiet farmhouse miles away, tracking the digital chaos erupting from the financial freeze. He explained exactly how a shadow lender operates when a massive wire transfer is intercepted by the federal government. The private equity firm did not view the Internal Revenue Service investigation as a legitimate excuse for delayed payment. They viewed it as a catastrophic breach of contract. The senior underwriter called Colin back less than an hour after the money was frozen. He did not use his polite professional voice this time. He spoke with the cold, flat tone of a man who destroys lives for a living. He told Colin that the $3 million was entirely out of reach, and the firm required immediate physical compensation. The firm demanded the physical keys, the alarm codes, and the absolute control of my $4 million estate by the end of the business day. The underwriter made a very clear and terrifying promise. If Colin failed to deliver the physical property by sunset, the firm would send a team of corporate recovery specialists to his personal residence to begin liquidating his life by force. Colin was officially out of time and out of options. He could no longer wait 14 days for the formal conservatorship hearing to wind its way through the slow legal system. The carefully constructed legal illusion of a concerned family dealing with an elderly father was completely abandoned. The polished, arrogant developer was instantly replaced by a terrified, desperate criminal. He needed to physically seize my house immediately. He needed to change the heavy brass locks, turn off the security system, and hand the property over to the shadow lenders before the sun went down. Anthony watched the digital footprint of Colin making frantic movements. Colin made a rapid series of phone calls to a shady commercial real estate broker he kept on retainer. This broker specialized in distressed properties and rapid cash liquidations, operating entirely in the gray areas of the law. Colin instructed the broker to meet him at my address immediately. He told the broker to bring an aggressive locksmith and a team of fast movers to begin clearing out my personal belongings. Colin planned to strip my entire life down to the bare wooden floors, pack my memories into garbage bags, and hand the empty shell to the private equity firm to save his own skin. Natalie was completely paralyzed by the escalating violence of the situation. She had agreed to sign forged medical documents and cry in front of television cameras because those actions felt distant and sterile. But physically breaking into her childhood home crossed a terrifying threshold she was not prepared to face. She watched her husband pacing the floor like a trapped animal screaming threats into his phone. Colin did not give her a choice. He grabbed her by the arm, pulled her out of their modern glass house, and pushed her violently into the passenger seat of his luxury car. He screamed at her that if they did not secure my estate right now, the men from the private equity firm would come and take everything they owned. He drove recklessly through the city streets, running red lights, and weaving through heavy traffic, completely consumed by blind panic. I listened to Anthony describe the digital interceptions, and I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. The violent, frantic energy of my son-in-law was the exact opposite of my own calculated patience. Colin believed that physical possession of the house would somehow override the legal reality of the trust. He believed he could simply smash a window, change a lock, and hand the property to his dangerous creditors. He did not understand that the physical house was no longer the collateral. The trustee subordination document had completely severed the debt from my home and permanently chained it to his own failing company. His desperate race to my front door was completely pointless. Anthony closed his heavy laptop and looked at me across the mahogany desk. He told me it was time to leave the safety of the farmhouse. We needed to be at my estate when Colin arrived. We needed to look him in the eye when the final invisible wall closed in around him. We drove back toward the city in Anthony's dark, heavy sedan. The afternoon sky was turning a dark, bruised purple, signaling an approaching winter storm. The freezing weather perfectly matched the absolute cold reality we were about to deliver. I thought about the house I had built with my late wife. I remembered laying the hardwood floors and planting the large oak trees in the front yard. I had intended for that house to be a sanctuary for my daughter to seek refuge whenever the world became too heavy. Now she was speeding toward it with a shady real estate broker desperate to tear it apart and sell it to the highest bidder. The betrayal no longer hurt my heart. It only sharpened my resolve to finish the job. I was returning to my home not as a victim running from a fake medical diagnosis, but as the absolute master of the board. Colin pulled his sleek vehicle into my quiet residential neighborhood. He parked aggressively on the front lawn, completely disregarding the manicured grass. The real estate broker and a man carrying a heavy bag of locksmith tools pulled up right behind him in a rusted van. Colin jumped out of the car and stormed up my front walkway. He did not bother ringing the doorbell or pretending to look for me. He pointed at the heavy oak front door and ordered the locksmith to drill straight through the deadbolt. He was screaming orders and sweating profusely, entirely blinded by his own panic. He thought he was breaking into an empty house to claim his stolen prize. He had absolutely no idea that the front door was already unlocked, and the man he tried to erase was sitting quietly inside, waiting to welcome him to his own financial funeral. Anthony and I sat in the dim light of my living room. I did not turn on the lamps. We sat in the heavy leather chairs I had purchased 3 decades ago, listening to the wind howl against the window panes. The silence inside the house was heavy, but it was no longer the suffocating silence of a victim hiding from his predators. It was the calm, absolute stillness of a hunter waiting for the trap to snap shut. 10 minutes later, we heard the violent screech of tires on the pavement outside. I stood up and walked quietly to the front window. Colin had parked his luxury vehicle aggressively on my front lawn, tearing deep, muddy trenches into the carefully manicured grass. A rusted van pulled up right behind him. Colin jumped out of his car, his face flushed red with blind panic and pure adrenaline. He was yelling frantic orders at 2 men who stepped out of the van. One was a slick-looking real estate broker wearing a cheap suit, and the other was a heavy-set locksmith carrying a massive canvas bag of tools. Colin pointed violently toward my front door, completely unaware that his entire life was about to end on my porch. I listened to their heavy footsteps echoing against the concrete walkway. Colin was screaming at the locksmith to drill straight through the deadbolt. He was telling the broker that the house was entirely empty and ready for an immediate aggressive cash liquidation. I heard the harsh metallic grinding of a heavy power drill spinning up right outside my door. I did not let the drill touch the brass. I reached out and turned the deadbolt myself. I grabbed the solid handle and pulled the heavy oak door completely open. The cold winter air rushed into the warm foyer. Colin was standing with his arm raised mid-sentence, pointing at the lock. His mouth dropped completely open, and all the color instantly drained from his face. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He expected to find an empty house abandoned by a panicked old man fleeing to Switzerland. Instead, he found me standing tall, wearing my tailored wool coat perfectly lucid, and staring at him with absolute cold contempt. Colin took a physical step backward, stumbling over the edge of the welcome mat. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic, stammering noise came out of his throat. He looked at me and then looked frantically down the street, as if expecting the police to suddenly appear and arrest me. Before his scattered mind could even formulate a single coherent sentence, Anthony stepped out from the shadows of the hallway and stood directly beside me. Anthony was wearing a sharp, dark suit and carrying a single manila folder. He looked at the shady real estate broker and the sweating locksmith with a terrifying professional glare. Anthony did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, lethal authority of a man who destroys corrupt executives for a living. He advised the two men to turn around, walk back to their van, and drive away immediately. He informed them that they were currently participating in an attempted federal wire fraud and illegal property seizure. The broker took one look at Anthony and recognized the dangerous aura of a senior corporate attorney. The broker did not ask a single question. He grabbed the locksmith by the arm, turned around, and ran back to the rusted van, leaving Colin standing entirely alone on my front porch. Colin was completely paralyzed. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the rapid collapse of his physical invasion. He finally found his voice and screamed at me that I was a fugitive. He yelled that he had the legal right to take my house because the private equity firm had just approved his $3 million loan. He arrogantly declared that the shadow lenders had the deed and the house no longer belonged to me. Anthony slowly opened the manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper. It was the trustee subordination document with the official state registry stamp glowing bright red at the top. Anthony stepped forward and held the document directly in front of Colin. Anthony calmly explained the fatal mistake Colin had made by assuming I owned the physical property as an individual. Anthony stated that the house was owned entirely by an irrevocable family trust, and Colin had just willingly triggered its deepest defensive mechanism. Anthony broke the legal terminology down into absolute devastating reality. He explained that by legally approving the collateral pledge through the trust framework, we had completely detached the physical real estate from the financial liability. Anthony told Colin that the private equity firm did not hold a valid lien against my $4 million estate. The trust document completely indemnified the physical property. Instead, the full weight of the $3 million debt had automatically and permanently attached itself to Colin's personal corporate holding company. Colin stared at the official state registry stamp on the paper, and his eyes widened in absolute horror. He realized the private equity firm had not given him the money because they liked his business plan. They gave him the money because my legally binding signature had authorized the loan, but he was entirely responsible for the repayment. My house was completely safe and untouchable behind an invisible legal wall. The final piece of the puzzle crashed down upon Colin. He remembered the terrifying phone call he had received an hour ago from the federal compliance officer. The $3 million from the private equity firm was currently locked inside his corporate bank account, frozen completely by the Internal Revenue Service, due to Anthony submitting the whistleblower report. Colin realized he could not access a single penny of the loan to pay off his commercial creditors. He could not access the money to pay back the shadow lenders. And he absolutely could not hand over my physical house to settle the violent debt because my house was legally protected by the trust. He had literally borrowed $3 million from dangerous men and handed it directly to the federal government. He was standing on the porch of a house he could not touch, owing a fortune. He could not pay, facing federal tax evasion charges. He could not escape. Colin slowly fell to his knees on the cold concrete walkway. He covered his face with his shaking hands and let out a hollow, broken sob. The arrogant predator had completely destroyed his own life, and I had simply opened the door to let him see the wreckage. I watched from the window as Colin dragged his completely broken body off my front walkway. He climbed back into his luxury vehicle with the heavy, slow movements of a dead man. The drive back to his modern glass and steel house must have been the longest journey of his entire life. He had arrived at my estate as an arrogant conqueror, and he was leaving as a federal criminal with a massive unpayable debt to a shadow syndicate. I did not need to be inside their sprawling living room that evening to know exactly how the final collapse of their marriage unfolded. The court records and the frantic text messages Sylvia sent me before she quietly packed her bags and left their employment painted a perfectly clear picture of their absolute ruin. When Colin walked through his front door, the illusion of their perfect, wealthy partnership shattered instantly. Natalie was waiting in the living room, pacing the hardwood floors and expecting him to return with the keys to my house. When she saw his pale, terrified face and his trembling hands, she knew the physical invasion had failed. She aggressively demanded to know what had happened. She screamed at him, asking why he did not have the signed deed. Colin did not offer her comfort or reassurance. The immense crushing pressure of the federal investigation and the private equity debt completely destroyed his polished facade. He looked at the woman he had married for her eventual inheritance, and he unleashed a torrent of vicious venom. Colin screamed that her father had completely outsmarted them. He confessed everything in a blind, frantic rage. He told her about the anonymous whistleblower report. He explained that the Internal Revenue Service had permanently frozen his corporate accounts and that the federal authorities were actively investigating him for massive tax evasion and fraud. He told her the $3 million from the private equity firm was locked inside a federal vault, and he could not access a single penny of it. Natalie stood completely paralyzed as the true magnitude of his financial incompetence washed over her. She realized her husband was not a brilliant commercial developer. He was a desperate con artist who had built a fragile house of cards, and the wind had finally blown it down. But the absolute worst revelation was yet to come. Colin coldly explained the devastating reality of the trust subordination document. He told her that my $4 million estate was completely protected by an irrevocable family trust. He screamed that he had unknowingly transferred the entire liability of the $3 million private equity loan directly onto his own personal holding company. He told Natalie that they owed a fortune to dangerous, ruthless men, and they had absolutely no money and no collateral left to pay them. The private equity recovery specialists were already looking for them. Natalie completely lost her mind. The foundation of her entire life was built on money and social status. Without those things, she had absolutely nothing. She physically attacked Colin, beating her fists against his chest and cursing him for dragging her into his criminal failures. She screamed that she was going to divorce him and tell the federal authorities that he acted entirely alone. Colin grabbed her wrists and pushed her away with a cruel, bitter laugh. He reminded her that she was standing on my driveway yesterday, preparing to lock her own father in a psychiatric ward. He reminded her that she was the one who personally hired the corrupt doctor and paid for the forged medical evaluation using her own credit card. He told her the federal authorities and the police would never view her as an innocent victim. They were completely tied together in a massive conspiracy to commit elder abuse and federal wire fraud. If he went to federal prison, she was going to be in the cell right next to him. The terrifying reality of her situation finally broke through her denial. Natalie collapsed onto the leather sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. But she was a woman entirely consumed by greed, and she refused to accept absolute defeat. In a moment of pure panicked delusion, she convinced herself that the original plan could still save them. She believed that if she could just finalize the emergency medical conservatorship, she could somehow force a judge to reverse the trust document. She frantically grabbed her mobile phone and dialed the private number of the corrupt psychiatrist they had hired to orchestrate my false dementia diagnosis. She expected the doctor to answer the phone with his usual arrogant, accommodating tone. She expected him to calm her down and assure her that his medical authority would override any legal maneuvering. The phone rang 5 times. When the doctor finally picked up the line, his voice was shaking with uncontainable terror. Natalie started screaming into the receiver, demanding that he push the court hearing forward to the very next morning. She told him they needed the official conservatorship decree immediately to unlock the frozen bank accounts and stop the private equity firm. The doctor cut her off with a sharp, panicked shout. He told her to never call his private number again. He revealed that less than an hour ago he had received a massive, horrifying notification from the state medical board. A senior corporate attorney had just filed a comprehensive formal complaint against his medical license. The complaint included high-resolution photographs of the forged dementia documents sitting on the desk in Colin Home Office. It included a detailed timeline proving the doctor had signed an emergency psychiatric hold for a man he had never even physically examined. The attorney had also forwarded the entire file to the district attorney office for a criminal fraud investigation. The corrupt doctor was facing the absolute destruction of his lucrative career and years in a state penitentiary. He told Natalie he was immediately retracting his medical evaluation. He stated that he was going to tell the medical board and the police that Colin and Natalie had completely manipulated him and provided false information about my mental state. He was going to testify against them in open court to save his own license and secure a plea deal. He screamed that they were toxic, completely radioactive, and he was cutting all ties with them permanently. He hung up the phone before Natalie could utter a single word in response. Natalie slowly lowered the phone from her ear. The dial tone echoed faintly in the massive silent room. The final pillar of their malicious plan had completely collapsed. The corrupt doctor had abandoned them to save himself. The bank accounts were permanently frozen by the federal government. The shadow lenders were actively hunting them to collect a $3 million debt. And the father they had tried to erase was sitting safely inside an impenetrable legal fortress. Colin and Natalie sat in their dark, expensive house entirely alone. They had turned on each other, the world had turned on them, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The court date was approaching, and they were going to have to face the absolute ruin they had built with their own hands. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse loomed at the end of the long marble hallway. Exactly 14 days had passed since the freezing night. I stood on my daughter's driveway and watched my family attempt to erase my existence. The agonizing wait was finally over. I stood in the corridor wearing my finest tailored suit, perfectly groomed, and projecting the absolute calm of a man who held all the cards. Standing directly to my left was Anthony holding a thick leather briefcase containing the final nails for their financial coffin. Standing to my right was the city chief of police, a man Anthony had contacted days ago to review the undeniable evidence of the forged medical documents and the attempted wire fraud. We waited in absolute silence, listening to the muffled voices coming from inside the courtroom. Inside those walls, Natalie was playing her final desperate hand. She and Colin were completely trapped by the shadow lenders and the federal tax investigators, but the court date for my conservatorship had remained on the official docket. Natalie was a woman entirely consumed by greed and sheer panic. In her delusional mind, she believed that if she could just manipulate the judge into granting the permanent asset transfer, she could somehow unlock my secondary retirement accounts and buy their way out of federal prison. I pushed the heavy brass handle slightly open, just enough to hear her performance. Natalie was standing before the judge, weeping with terrifying conviction. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She held a crumpled tissue to her face and let her voice tremble with manufactured grief. She told the judge that her beloved father had been missing for 2 weeks. She painted a tragic picture of a confused, vulnerable old man wandering the dangerous city streets, lost in the darkness of advanced dementia. She begged the court to grant her full legal control of my entire financial portfolio immediately. She claimed that having access to my funds was the only way she could afford to hire private investigators to bring me home safely. The judge listened with a sympathetic expression, completely unaware that the weeping woman in his courtroom was a calculated predator. The judge gently asked Natalie about the medical professional who had signed the initial emergency hold. He noted that the doctor was not present in the courtroom to testify. Natalie did not miss a beat. She lied with breathtaking ease, claiming the doctor was dealing with a sudden family emergency, but had assured her the signed affidavit was entirely sufficient to finalize the decree. Colin sat at the plaintiff table behind her, staring blankly at the wooden grain. He looked like a hollow ghost. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame, and his hands shook constantly. He knew the absolute ruin waiting for them outside the courthouse, but he lacked the courage to stop his wife from digging their grave even deeper. The judge nodded slowly and reached for his wooden gavel. He stated that given the tragic circumstances and the emergency nature of my disappearance, he was prepared to sign the final conservatorship order. Natalie let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief and pressed her hands to her chest. She believed she had won. She believed she had successfully stolen my life. I pushed the heavy oak doors completely open. The heavy brass hinges groaned loudly, echoing across the silent courtroom. The sharp, authoritative sound of my leather shoes stepping onto the polished wooden floor cut through the tension like a knife. Every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. The court bailiff reached for his radio, but froze when he saw the chief of police walking directly beside me. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. I did not look confused. I did not look frightened. I walked with the unshakable posture of a logistics director, surveying a completely conquered boardroom. I kept my eyes locked directly on my daughter. Natalie stopped breathing. The crumpled tissue fell from her trembling hands and landed softly on the floor. Her eyes widened in absolute sheer terror as she stared at the man she had just declared legally incompetent and missing. She backed away from the plaintiff table, stumbling slightly on her expensive heels. Colin looked up and let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying his face entirely in his hands. We reached the wooden gate separating the gallery from the court floor. The judge lowered his gavel and stared at me in complete astonishment. He looked at the paperwork on his desk and then looked back at me, trying to reconcile the tragic fictional story with the sharp, immaculate reality standing in his courtroom. He demanded to know what was happening and who was interrupting his proceedings. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute perfect clarity, ensuring every single word echoed against the high plaster walls. I introduced myself formally to the court. I stated my full legal name and confirmed that I was the exact man listed on the fraudulent petition sitting on his desk. I told the judge that I was not missing. I was not wandering the streets, and my mind was sharper than it had ever been in my entire life. Natalie tried to salvage her broken illusion. She reached out toward me, crying out my name and acting as if my sudden appearance was a miraculous blessing. She took a step forward, pretending she wanted to embrace me. I did not move. I simply raised my hand and pointed a single commanding finger directly at her. I told her to stop performing. The absolute freezing cold authority in my voice stopped her dead in her tracks. The chief of police stepped forward and addressed the bench. He informed the judge that my disappearance was a calculated survival tactic. He stated that for the past 14 days, he had been working closely with me and federal authorities to uncover a massive coordinated conspiracy to commit elder fraud, grand larceny, and medical forgery. The chief pointed directly at Colin and Natalie, announcing to the entire room that the grieving daughter and the supportive husband were actually the primary targets of a severe federal criminal investigation. The sympathetic expression on the judge's face completely vanished, replaced instantly by a dark, furious scowl. He realized he had almost been used as an unwilling pawn in a massive criminal theft. He ordered Natalie to sit down immediately and demanded the bailiff lock the courtroom doors. The tragic play was officially over. The invisible wall had completely fallen away, and the bright, harsh light of reality was shining directly on the monsters who had tried to bury me alive. I walked up to the heavy wooden bench where the judge sat looking down at us in complete confusion. Anthony stood right beside me and placed his thick leather briefcase gently onto the polished wooden railing. The silence in the locked courtroom was so absolute that the simple click of the brass latches sounded like a physical blow. I did not speak with anger or raise my voice to match the frantic energy Natalie had displayed just moments ago. I spoke with the cold, mechanical precision of a man dismantling a highly explosive device. I looked up at the judge and told him that the woman crying on the floor behind me had not come to this court to protect my life. She had come to this court to steal it. Anthony pulled out the first thick stack of papers and handed them to the court bailiff. The bailiff passed them up to the judge. I explained clearly that those pages were high-resolution photographs taken directly inside Colin Home Office exactly 14 days ago. I instructed the judge to look closely at the digital timestamps printed on the bottom corner of every single image. I explained that the photographs showed the completed medical evaluation, declaring me completely incompetent and a danger to myself. But those photographs were taken 5 full hours before I was even invited to their house for the fake reconciliation dinner. I told the court that they had purchased my medical diagnosis before they even attempted to evaluate my physical health. They had fabricated my advanced dementia solely to create a legal weapon against me. The judge stared at the photographs for a long, terrible moment. His face turned completely pale as he read the forged documents and realized the sheer depth of the premeditation. He looked down at Natalie, who was now sitting entirely frozen on the wooden bench. Her manufactured tears had completely dried up, replaced by the hollow stare of a trapped animal. I did not give them a single moment to recover or invent a new lie. I told Anthony to hand over the second piece of evidence. Anthony pulled out a massive bound financial ledger and handed it to the bailiff. I told the judge that a fake illness of this magnitude requires a very real and very desperate motive. I instructed the bench to look at the highlighted banking records and the commercial private equity loan application. I explained that my arrogant son-in-law had completely bankrupted his commercial development firm through reckless offshore gambling and gross mismanagement. To save his own skin, he had sought out a $3 million bridge loan from a ruthless shadow syndicate. But the syndicate required massive physical collateral. I pointed to the final signature line on the loan application copy. I told the judge that Colin had forged my name to pledge my entire $4 million estate as the guarantee for his stolen money. But Colin knew the shadow lenders would eventually demand a legally verified title transfer before the end of the month. He could not forge a notarized property deed entirely on his own. I explained that the emergency conservatorship petition currently sitting on the judge's desk was nothing more than a criminal mechanism designed to bypass state property laws. They needed the court to officially declare me incompetent, so Natalie could legally sign my house over to the dangerous men her husband owed money to. They were using the courtroom as a tool for federal wire fraud. The sheer audacity of the crime hung heavily in the air. The judge looked at the massive paper trail perfectly connecting the forged signatures, the failing bank accounts, and the fake medical records. The timeline was absolutely undeniable. Every single lie they had told was perfectly documented, systematically exposed, and laid bare under the bright fluorescent lights. But Colin tried one last pathetic, desperate maneuver. He stood up from his chair, his legs shaking violently against the wooden table. He pointed a trembling finger at me and yelled to the judge that the photographs were completely illegal. He screamed that I was still a sick, delusional old man, and that the original doctor evaluation was still a valid binding medical document. He claimed his financial problems were completely separate from my declining mental health. He was drowning in his own lies and trying to grab onto a completely imaginary lifeline. The chief of police stepped forward and completely severed that lifeline. He addressed the judge directly, and his deep voice commanded absolute respect. The chief stated that his officers had visited the private psychiatric clinic very early this morning. He informed the court that the expensive private doctor who signed the emergency hold was currently sitting in a cold interrogation room at the downtown police precinct. The chief revealed that the doctor had completely collapsed under questioning and confessed to the entire fraudulent scheme. The doctor admitted that he had never examined me in his entire life. He admitted that Natalie had personally paid him $20,000 in cash to write the false report and to provide the men with the leather restraints in the unmarked van. The chief reached into his own jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. He placed the official signed confession of the corrupt doctor directly onto the judge's desk. The final strike was completely flawless. There was absolutely no room for debate. There was no room for fake tears or emotional manipulation. The medical lie was dead. The financial theft was exposed. The physical trap they had laid for me was completely dismantled in front of the highest legal authority in the county. I stood tall and looked at the daughter I had raised. I looked at the man she had chosen to marry. They were no longer arrogant predators. They were small, terrified criminals trapped inside a cage they had built entirely with their own greed. The judge picked up his wooden gavel and let it fall against the sounding block with a loud cracking noise that echoed like a gunshot. The sound signaled the absolute end of the illusion. He leaned over the heavy wooden bench and looked down at my daughter and her husband with a profound disgust that words could barely capture. The judge stated that in his 30 years on the bench, he had never witnessed a more malicious and calculated attempt to manipulate the legal system for personal financial gain. He did not ask them for an explanation. He did not give Natalie a chance to offer another weeping apology. He formally dismissed the emergency conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice. He declared that the filing was a fraudulent document and ordered it to be immediately turned over to the district attorney as physical evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy. The judge then picked up his pen and signed a secondary emergency mandate. He looked directly at Colin and informed him that the court was permanently freezing any remaining personal bank accounts and physical assets in his name to prevent the destruction of evidence. Cullen stood at the plaintiff table completely frozen. His expensive designer suit suddenly looked entirely out of place on a man who had just been reduced to a cornered criminal. He opened his mouth to speak, but the chief of police raised his hand and signaled to the back of the room. Two heavily armed uniformed police officers stepped through the side door of the courtroom and walked directly toward the plaintiff table. The heavy sound of their boots against the polished wooden floor felt like a ticking clock reaching its final second. Colin took a step backward, knocking his wooden chair over. He looked at Natalie, begging her silently to do something, but she violently pulled herself away from him, pressing her back against the wooden railing. She was entirely consumed by her own terror and completely willing to let him drown alone. The officers grabbed Colin by his arms and violently twisted them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the loudest sound in the entire room. It was the sound of absolute finality. The senior officer read Colin his rights, stating clearly that he was being placed under immediate arrest for attempted grand larceny forgery, federal wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. Colin did not fight back. His legs completely gave out, and the officers had to physically drag him toward the center aisle. He looked like an empty, broken shell of the arrogant developer who had tried to drill through my front door just a few days prior. But the absolute ruin of his life was not quite finished. As the police officers dragged Colin up the center aisle toward the heavy oak doors, the doors suddenly swung open from the outside. 3 men wearing immaculate dark suits and carrying thick leather briefcases stepped into the courtroom. They did not look like police detectives or local prosecutors. They radiated a cold, terrifying corporate efficiency. I looked over at Anthony and saw a dark, satisfied smile spread across his face. Anthony leaned toward me and whispered that he had made one final anonymous phone call this morning to the senior underwriter of the private equity firm. Anthony had told the Shadowlenders exactly where they could find the man who had stolen their $3 million. The three corporate lawyers stepped directly into the path of the police officers. The lead attorney did not look at the police. He looked directly into Colin's terrified eyes. The attorney pulled a thick stack of legal notices from his briefcase and shoved them violently into the front pocket of Colin's suit jacket. The attorney spoke with a low, dangerous voice that carried through the silent gallery. He informed Colin that the private equity firm was currently executing an immediate hostile seizure of his personal residence, his luxury vehicles, and his entire corporate portfolio. The attorney stated that moving crews were already inside the glass and steel house packing up everything they owned. Colin let out a raw, pathetic scream that cracked in his throat. He had lost absolutely everything in the span of 5 minutes. His freedom was gone. His money was locked inside a federal vault. His house was being stripped bare by ruthless Shadowlenders, and the father-in-law he had considered weak and obsolete was standing quietly at the front of the room, completely untouchable. The police officers pushed past the corporate lawyers and dragged Colin out of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, leaving a profound, empty silence in their wake. The massive, predatory machine he had built to destroy my life had completely reversed its gears and crushed him into dust. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom clicked shut behind the police officers, leaving a profound and heavy silence in their wake. The massive, predatory machine my daughter and her husband had built to destroy my life had completely reversed its gears. I stood at the front of the room and looked at Natalie. She was still pressed tightly against the wooden railing, shivering uncontrollably in her expensive designer dress. The arrogant, entitled woman who had confidently lied to the judge just 10 minutes ago was completely gone. She was entirely alone. Her husband was on his way to a federal holding cell, and the ruthless Shadowlenders were currently stripping her home down to the bare wooden floors. She looked around the empty gallery, and her eyes finally locked onto mine. She realized in that terrifying moment that I was the absolute only lifeline she had left in the entire world. She pushed herself away from the railing and stumbled toward me. Her expensive heels clacked unevenly against the polished floor. She did not try to play the role of the concerned caregiver anymore. She reverted instantly to the role of a frightened little girl, asking her father to fix a broken toy. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the sleeve of my tailored wool coat. She sobbed genuine tears of absolute terror and begged me to save her. She pleaded with me to use my $4 million estate to pay off the private equity firm so they would stop liquidating her life. She begged me to hire the best defense attorneys in the city to keep Colin out of federal prison. She promised she would leave him if I just let her move back into her childhood bedroom and protected her from the consequences of their actions. She invoked the memory of her late mother, crying that my wife would never want to see her only child destroyed like this. A very small, fragile part of my heart felt the ancient, familiar pull of a father wanting to shield his little girl from the harshness of the world. But the brilliant, calculating logistics director inside my mind immediately crushed that dangerous instinct. I looked down at her hands gripping my coat. I remembered standing in the freezing cold on her driveway, watching an unmarked van pull up to her house. I remembered the heavy leather restraints, the corrupt doctor, and the forged papers designed to lock me in a padded room until the day I died. I gently but firmly reached down and removed her hands from my arm. I stepped back, creating a permanent physical distance between us. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and spoke with an absolute, definitive calm. I told her that the mother she just invoked would be entirely sickened by the monster she had become. I told her I would not spend a single penny of the money I worked 40 years to earn to save the men who tried to bury me alive. I reminded her that she wanted my estate with such greedy desperation that she was willing to erase my existence to get it. I told her she could not have the estate, but she was entirely welcome to keep the catastrophic debt that came with it. I told her she was no longer my daughter. She was simply a consequence of her own terrible choices. I turned my back on her for the absolute final time and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, leaving her weeping alone in the ruins of her own making. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the county courthouse and stepped out into the crisp winter afternoon. The freezing air hit my face, but for the first time in 14 days, it did not feel like a threat. It felt completely clean and deeply refreshing. I stood at the top of the concrete steps and looked down at the bustling city streets. The pedestrians rushing past had absolutely no idea that a massive silent war had just been fought and won behind those stone walls. I took a long, slow breath and felt the immense crushing weight finally lift from my chest. I had spent the last 2 weeks running through shadows, sleeping in cheap motels, and treating every passing siren like a death sentence. But I had successfully navigated the most dangerous conflict of my entire life. I had delivered the absolute truth, and I had completely starved the predators. I walked down the steps and hailed a waiting taxi. I gave the driver the address of the international airport. I leaned back against the leather seat and watched the city skyline roll past the window. I thought about the massive glass and steel house where my daughter was currently packing her belongings under the watchful eyes of ruthless corporate liquidators. I thought about the $4 million estate I had protected. I realized that the true victory was not keeping the money. The true victory was the absolute permanent removal of the toxic elements from my life. A diseased branch of a family tree must be completely severed to save the roots. I did not feel any lingering sorrow or regret. The love I once held for my daughter had been entirely burned away by her terrifying greed. What remained was a profound, unbreakable sense of self-respect. The taxi pulled up to the busy departure terminal. I paid the driver and stepped out into the chaotic flow of travelers. This time I was not standing on a cold parking garage roof watching a hired decoy wear my coat. This time I was walking through the sliding glass doors under my own name with my own passport securely in my pocket. I moved through the security checkpoints with the calm, steady pace of a man who has absolutely nothing left to hide and no one left to fear. The terminal was bright and loud, filled with the hopeful energy of people traveling toward new beginnings. I walked to my designated gate and handed the flight attendant my first-class boarding pass. I boarded the aircraft and took my seat near the front window. I ordered a glass of sparkling water and looked out at the sprawling city shrinking away as the massive plane lifted into the afternoon sky. The dark clouds of the winter storm were finally breaking apart, allowing bright shafts of golden sunlight to spill across the distant horizon. I was flying toward a quiet coastal town thousands of miles away, where the air was warm and the steady rhythm of the ocean replaced the chaotic noise of greed and betrayal. I had legally secured my wealth, and I had permanently protected my dignity. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady, powerful hum of the jet engines carrying me forward. The war was completely over, and the rest of my life was finally mine to live in absolute, beautiful peace. The most profound lesson this story teaches is that family is defined by mutual respect, not merely by shared blood. When greed replaces gratitude, those sacred bonds inevitably shatter. Howard's journey reminds us that true strength does not lie in screaming or fighting aggressively, but in quiet, calculated patience. We must protect our peace and our life's work, even from those we love the most, if they prove themselves to be predators. Sometimes, the ultimate act of self-preservation is having the courage to sever the tie, walk away, and let toxic people bear the absolute weight of their own destructive choices. If you found strength in Howard's story of reclaiming his life and walking away from a toxic family, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.